We know this territory. Those were the words of two United Church ministers when talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, a phenomenon often described as unprecedented, yet we know this territory, these two ministers affirmed. We've been through this before. As a student minister, and the only minister for the small congregation that I serve, I have found the COVID-19 pandemic truly challenging. By the very nature of my position, people are looking to me for leadership. But these days, I have no sense of direction. I have little idea how to navigate through the wilderness of this new normal. And it seems like everyone else around me also feels the same. In the early days of the pandemic, however, as I watched communities of faith close down their buildings, I did begin to wonder about potential parallels between the COVID-19 pandemic and churches affected by natural disasters. You see, both experiences, pandemic and natural disaster, appeared in my mind to share in common an experience that I call congregational exile, a prolonged period of time during which a community of faith is denied access to their customary place of gathering due to unexpected forces beyond their control. Curious about this possible connection, if any, I decided to investigate the following question. How has a previous experience of congregational exile influenced ministerial leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic? My methodology for this project was a case study approach to examine in detail one United Church community of faith that had experienced some form of congregational exile in the past and ideally was still served by the same paid accountable clergy. Southport United Church, my pseudonym, met these criteria. Years earlier, Southport United Church experienced a flood and could not use their building while it was being repaired. During that time, and still today, team ministers Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex, pseudonyms, worked together to offer leadership. I'm so grateful to them and to the board of Southport United Church for accepting my invitation to participate. Once I located this case, I collected data through two lengthy interviews with both Reverend Alex and Reverend Jordan. I also facilitated a focus group discussion with 4 lay members of the Southport congregation. In addition, I looked at blog posts, sermons, annual reports, and other documents, taking all of this information, coding it, and organizing it into themes. Throughout this process, a clear relationship emerged between the flood in the past and the pandemic in the present. For example, yes, it's different than a flood, says Reverend Jordan, but I just have this little sense of, yeah, we do know this territory. We know what this is going to be like. Likewise, Reverend Alex says, it still very much feels like what was in the past continues to inform how I'm doing now in terms of the leadership that we're offering. Reverend Alex continues, we have this awareness that is a gift that's not available to everyone. Having been through a disaster, we know how to approach this pandemic with a few more tools in the box. Jody from the congregation agrees. I think that they, the ministers, brought a certain wisdom to those decisions that had to be made for us in this time from their experience. So, what was this wisdom? What were these extra tools in the box? How has this gift of awareness informed the leadership that Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex have offered since the COVID-19 pandemic began? As I interpreted all of the data, to me, 5 overarching answers emerged. I discerned 5 lessons that these two ministers learned. Lessons from their first experience of congregational exile that directly influenced their leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, for the sake of time, the following presentation of the 5 lessons will only be the highlight reel, the main points. And I invite you to check out my future final paper for further examples and other details. But the first lesson from exile is this. Lesson 1. In the disruption of exile, pivot one's approach. For Southport United Church, both experiences of congregational exile involved an element of disruption. Whether due to the flood or due to the pandemic, ministry as usual could not continue. As a result, Reverend Alex and Reverend Jordan learned that in the midst of such disruption, they would need to pivot their approach. They would need to let go, lead from the front, and lightly hold plans. Everything we thought we were working toward before the flood got sort of thrown up in the air, says Reverend Jordan. But from that sense of loss came almost liberation, a permission during the later pandemic to release what was in order to more fully embrace what was needed. I think it's just in the being open, Reverend Jordan remarks. God can work possibility. It doesn't have to be the way it was. For Reverend Alex, letting go is even more of an imperative. The grasping and hanging on to preferred ways of working is not going to be helpful. We've got to get over ourselves enough to be able to adapt. And I think that requires a lot of letting go. When it came to the flood, one thing that Reverend Alex and Reverend Jordan had to let go of was a shared goal of making the church less minister focused. In the years leading up to the flood, we were really intentionally working at the church becoming less minister centered, Reverend Jordan says. However, after the flood, Reverend Jordan continues, it was just like, no, they need us to be the pastors because everybody is traumatized. The two ministers learned that they needed to pivot and lead from the front, to step forward and proactively utilize their ministerial influence, knowing that people would be looking to them to set the tone, set the example, and set the agenda. Folks will take their cues from how we are reacting and responding, says Reverend Alex. A realization that has played a large role in Reverend Alex and Reverend Jordan's later approach to leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet, overall, in the midst of exile, both ministers learned to lightly hold plans. Anything you're working on can be gone in a moment, says Reverend Jordan. And so it's to hold lightly and let the love of God flow through that. Let go. Lead from the front. Lightly hold plans. Lesson 1. In the disruption of exile, pivot one's approach. Lesson 2. In the disconnection of exile, prioritize relationships. For Southport United Church, both experiences of congregational exile also involved an element of disconnection. In fact, during the flood, there were many layers of disconnection, from geographical separation to gaps in communication to even a number of members who were never heard from again. Through that experience, Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex learned to prioritize relationships, to foster connectivity, to focus on presence, and to form supportive partnerships. Right from the get-go of the flood, says Reverend Alex, we realized that it's the relationships that matter most. The circumstances are very different, Reverend Alex admits, but to this day, fostering the relationships, maintaining the attachments continues to be high priority. During the pandemic, Reverend Alex and Reverend Jordan have sought to foster connectivity through a variety of forms. They intentionally chose Zoom for Sunday morning worship in order for people to see each other and to get some sense of interaction. They offered a daily prayer, inviting individuals to pray every day at the exact same time, helping them to feel connected through, quote, the heart of God. They also organized a phone list, held midweek Zoom coffee hours, and conducted many doorstep visits for individuals that weren't able to connect through technology. Now you might be wondering, how on earth did they do all this? When did they write their sermons? Well, that's where the second point comes in. Focus on presence. We quickly realized in the flood, reflects Reverend Jordan, that it didn't really matter what the worship was. It is the presence, not the product. And so we did go into the pandemic saying, it is our presence, not the product of what we're doing. It's attending to the connection more than the input. Right now, for example, Reverend Alex and Reverend Jordan's sermons are typically written in about 30 minutes. Some are even adapted from previous years. More time is put towards being present rather than producing new or highly polished content. Finally, in the disconnection of exile, both ministers realized that they needed to form supportive partnerships, not only for the sake of their congregation and wider community, but also for the sake of themselves. In the words of Reverend Jordan, it was really learning in the flood that we can't do this alone. We really need outside voices and outside people. Foster connectivity. Focus on presence. Form supportive partnerships. Lesson number 2. In the disconnection of exile, prioritize relationships. Which brings us to lesson 3. In the disorientation of exile, provide a framework. To quote one of the congregants, exile means being separated from what's comfortable. Nothing seems familiar. You can't depend on something to always be the way it used to be. In order to address the disorienting effects of exile, especially all of the difficult emotions emerging as a result, both Reverend Alex and Reverend Jordan realized that they had to provide a framework to help individuals find their bearings, their footing, in the midst of a deeply discombobulating time. This aim of providing a framework involved four aspects: to introduce emotional vocabulary, to instill a sense of normalcy, to integrate scripture and theology, and to illuminate the road ahead. In terms of introducing emotional vocabulary, one of the things that came out of the flood, one of our roles, says Reverend Jordan, is how do we give people language to express what they're feeling? I think that's one of the roles that was honed in the flood and extends now, Reverend Jordan continues, helping give language to people. Language of alarm, of frustration, of grief, of loss, and more. But as these difficult emotions began to be acknowledged and named, these two ministers also wanted to instill a sense of normalcy, to assure the congregation that whatever they were feeling in the moment was natural, acceptable, usual, allowed. For example, these are some thoughts based on our church's previous experience of disaster, writes Reverend Alex in a blog post. It's normal and okay to acknowledge that you may not be running at your standard capacity right now. It's to be expected. Furthermore, Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex became aware quite early on in the flood that they would need to integrate into their framework an alternative theological understanding than that of many other churches in their area. Unlike these other churches, we weren't saying, oh, God will get us through this, or God did this to us because we have homosexuals in the community, says Reverend Jordan. For us, it was just really coming down to God is with us. A theology of divine presence, even in the midst of immense disorientation. Later, during the pandemic, Reverend Alex and Reverend Jordan also turned to the Psalms as a further reorienting resource. A way of helping our folks find language, Reverend Alex explains, to allow the psalmist to give them some words to express what's going on for them. Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex also learned in the flood that in the midst of the disorientation of exile, they needed to illuminate the road ahead. I remember us being told when we started with the flood, this will be a 3 to 5 year recovery, shares Reverend Jordan, a well-attested fact that these ministers would openly and repeatedly share with the members of Southport United Church. And in the words of Taylor, one such member, having that long vision is certainly one of the things they've learned from the flood going into COVID. As a result of this long vision, Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex's ministry leadership was grounded in reality, not in denial or even false hope. We know this journey, Reverend Jordan says. We don't get any honeymoon. There's no illusions, no naivete. We're going straight to the valley. Introduce emotional vocabulary. Instill a sense of normalcy. Integrate scripture and theology. Illuminate the road ahead. Lesson number 3. In the disorientation of exile, provide a framework. Followed by lesson 4. In the distraction of exile, pay attention. During the flood, in the words of Reverend Jordan, everyone had to deal with 5,000 decisions, all those little details that were demanded every moment. Yet, as the ones responsible for offering leadership, Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex quickly realized that they had to stay focused on a few crucial matters that might otherwise easily fall through the cracks. They learned to pay attention to alarm and frustration, to addiction and abuse, to adrenaline-based activity, and to attenuation, in other words, fatigue. In terms of alarm and frustration, it's listening for and paying attention to the emotions, Reverend Jordan explains, and not getting caught up in the details. If a congregant sent a rather heated email, for example, Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex learned to step back, to pay attention to and recognize the pre-conscious emotions behind the person's words. Based on their previous experience of the flood, Reverend Alex and Reverend Jordan also knew that in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, addictions and abuse would dramatically increase. Thus, I think that we knew to pay attention for that, says Reverend Jordan. It's been just having sort of this spidey sense of going in and paying attention. These two ministers also learned to pay attention to adrenaline-based activity. All of the energy, the euphoria, and the adrenaline-based energy that goes into the first few weeks following a disaster, I'm noticing an exact same curve between the flood and COVID, remarks Reverend Alex. It's not like we were totally immune to it, Reverend Alex admits, but we could catch it more quickly and just say, this is just not going to work. We just need to take our time, just pace ourselves, slow it down. Related to that is the fourth and final aspect of paying attention to attenuation, i.e. fatigue. The wisdom that we've gleaned from the flood, says Reverend Alex, helps us operate much more realistically with what we can and cannot do, based on the energy available to us. It's having learned how we need to sustain ourselves to do this work, adds Reverend Jordan, that I think has been brought into a greater forefront by these two experiences. Alarm and frustration, addiction and abuse, adrenaline-based activity, attenuation. Lesson 4. In the distraction of exile, pay attention. And finally, lesson 5. In the despair of exile, plant gardens. A few months after the flood, aware of the potential for despair in the hearts and minds of their congregants, Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex knew that they had to somehow preach about living in relationship with water, So, Reverend Alex says, I've been playing around with what does it mean to take up a relationship with this pandemic? It's not going anywhere anytime soon, Reverend Alex continues. So, being in relationship with the pandemic means understanding, for the time being at least, that this is our normal. It means choosing to settle in to this new land. To encourage this process of living in relationship with the COVID-19 pandemic, rather than succumbing to a sense of helpless, even hopeless despair. Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex have recently turned to the metaphor of planting gardens, as found in the exilic text of Jeremiah 29, verse 5. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. This is our new home for a while, the ministers write in a recent blog post. So here we build, we plant, we love, and we live as a people of faith filled with hope for the future. 5 lessons from exile. In the disruption of exile, pivot one's approach. In the disconnection of exile, prioritize relationships. In the disorientation of exile, provide a framework. In the distraction of exile, pay attention. And in the despair of exile, plant gardens. Now, before we look at implications, it needs to be acknowledged that there are some limitations to the study. First, due to time constraints, there was limited congregational input. It would have been beneficial to have had even more insight from other lay members of Southport United Church. How was the ministerial leadership that was offered during the flood and or during the pandemic actually perceived and received from the pews? I caught a glimpse of this perspective, but I would have liked more. Another limitation, as raised by one of my research consultants, has to do with the distortive effects of trauma. People who have been traumatized, those who have gone through a natural disaster, for example, don't always remember things accurately. Memory is lost. Memory is clouded. That's simply part of the nature of trauma, but nonetheless, a limitation of the study that does need to be named. And most importantly, this research has focused on one particular bounded case. The 5 lessons outlined derive from one particular context, the ministerial leadership for Southport United Church during a natural disaster in the past, and are directed to one particular context, the ministerial leadership for Southport United Church during the COVID-19 pandemic. These lessons cannot and ought not be extrapolated beyond the bounds of this one specific case. To generalize and say that these are 5 lessons for every minister or every church, or any other minister or church for that matter, would overstep the inherent limits of a qualitative case study research project. That said, speaking personally, I have found these 5 lessons from exile to be immensely valuable for my own ministry. As I do my best to offer leadership in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, the results of this research have proven truly meaningful, even transformative, as I adapt them for the context in which I currently serve. from letting go of previous preferences in order to pivot, to naming and normalizing the emotions in the room, to paying attention to things that honestly weren't on my radar, to taking a look at the long-term journey that still lies in store and sharing that perspective through my sermons and other written materials. From my own experience, I can attest to the wisdom and practical value of this project. These 5 lessons from Exile may not provide a detailed map, but they have given me direction. They have served as helpful road signs as I navigate through the wilderness of this new normal. Furthermore, what I see in this data, in this single rich case of Southport United Church's experience of congregational exile, past and present, is an invitation and an encouragement for everyone. The invitation that this research offers is this: every crisis is an opportunity to prepare for the next one. In other words, what are we learning about ourselves and our communities right now that will inform our own leadership in the future? And the encouragement that this research offers is this: we can look forward to hindsight. We can be expectant of future wisdom from this present moment. And we can use hindsight to look forward. We can utilize the present wisdom that we already have from the past. If we do, perhaps when we too face the next unprecedented crisis, whatever it might happen to be, all of us can also confidently say, we know this territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Very thoughtful, fascinating, and filled with wisdom that I'm sure all of us will be taking with us as we continue our work of not just shaping faithful, effective leaders, but being faithful and effective leaders. So we have about 15 minutes for questions to Matthew. So please use the Q&A box to ask your questions, and you can use the chat too. I see there's already a question in the chat box. So Matthew, we'll start with that one. Barbara asks, how did the ministers of Southport United Church view the empowerment of the laity and their calls during the initial disaster of the flood?
That's a great question, Barbara. Thanks for asking it. Couple things, a couple components to that answer. Let me just close the chat box so I'm not distracted further. One would be, in the immediate wake of the disaster, Barbara, as mentioned in the first lesson, in the disruption of exile, pivot one's approach. The 2 ministers of Southport, really before the first congregational exile, had taken a very empowering approach. They really were trying to be less minister-centered. But in the wake of the disaster, in that, especially the initial disruption, the disconnection, the disorientation, etc., they realized they had to lead from the front, really to be the pastors and to take that primary role. I got the hunch, though, as that initial shock subsided, certainly they called in, they empowered folks in the congregation to step in and help. And that was part of the one lesson in terms of not doing it on their own. They quickly learned that they needed supportive partnerships. I don't know if you remember that component. And one of the supportive partnerships that I did not mention just because of time was pulling together a team of folks from within the congregation to take care of some of those 5,000 demands and decisions, allowing the ministers to put their time and attention to the urgent pastoral needs, the things that only the pastor could do. So there was a team from within the congregation that was pulled together. And as the shock subsided, I know that they shifted some of that control as best they could. And then COVID happened, and they led from the front again. So there was a little bit of a curve up and down. I hope that answers that, Barbara.
Great, thank you. So we have another question, and keep them coming, please. So, question in the Q&A box from Brenda, who is curious about the facts of the flood. Specifically, were people in harm's way? Because that's certainly the case now with COVID.
I'm just reading the other half. That COVID should be capitalized. Oh, okay. I'm curious about the facts that were people in harm's way. Without going into too many details for the sake of preserving as much anonymity as possible for the case site, Brenda, I don't believe too many people were in harm's way. I don't think any lives were directly lost from the flood from the congregation, though certainly I know a year after there were many deaths from senior members, just I think after the shock of that all.
Right, thank you. So, question from Kate Jones, who was in your shoes a couple of years ago doing her own grad presentation. She says, great presentation. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the theological implications of exile, a very biblical concept. Did the theology of exile influence the experience of the congregation that you studied or your analysis of the experience?
Did the theology of exile influence the experience of the congregation you studied or your analysis of their experience? You know, Kate, I'm not sure I can answer that, truly, fully, because there's only so much, as you know, you can get into in such a short amount of time interviewing congregants. However, one thing I can share is the primary scriptural passage that was drawn upon in the aftermath of the flood was an exilic text from Isaiah. Though you pass through the waters, though you pass through the fire, I will be with you, I walk with you. And so I don't know how much more of the exile theology was drawn upon, but that text, an exilic text, certainly was formative, and then came back during the theological response to COVID from these two ministers.
Thank you. Okay, a question from a faculty member, Dr. Susan Wilhock. Thanks for your research. In terms of the disconnectedness, how did the congregation's Zoom worship specifically help overcome disconnectedness to prioritize relationships? Because Zoom worship can seem disembodied and we become talking heads. And I think that could be the case for Zoom webinars too, maybe. She continues, I think about children and youth who are online 5 days a week for school. So Zoom Sunday worship could contribute to more screen fatigue. So with particular reference to children and youth, how would you answer this?
Hi, Dr. Wilhock. To answer your first question in terms of how did Zoom specifically help overcome disconnectedness to prioritize relationships, a key component of the Sunday morning Zoom worship for Southport United Church was doing breakout groups near the end of the service. And so, 50, 60 people would be signed on to Zoom, and near the end, they'd be broken off into breakout groups of about 4 or 5 people. And talking to the congregants in the focus group of that experience, they loved it. They got a chance to just chat. It didn't have to be about that Sunday morning worship. It was a chance to connect, and even connect with people they may never have talked to during coffee hour in the physical building. That was something that Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex noticed as well, that even different connections were being formed than would have ever been formed years prior. So I hope that kind of addresses your first aspect of the question. For children and youth, in terms of screen fatigue, that didn't come up in our interviews, but in terms of building relationships with children and youth in the midst of being zoomed out, one of the countless doorstep visits that Reverend Jordan and Reverend Alex intentionally made was to all of the families in their congregation. I know they have a ritual. I don't remember the details, maybe grade 3 or 4. The grade 3 or 4 kids get something and the grade 12s get something. And so they visited all of those kids and all the families with gifts, their traditional gifts for those transitions, along with activity kits, like a Sunday school at home. So that doesn't have to do with Zoom worship, but a very intentional effort was made to make face-to-face contact with all the children and youth in the congregation.
Great. We're going to go to another faculty question. This one's in the chat, and it's a follow-up to Kate Jones's question. It's from Dr. Daniel Driver. How are you using the language of exile as part of your theological framework for research? Is it a metaphor? Have you reflected on its connection to biblical and theological traditions? And what are its limits as a metaphor, if any?
Oof, that's like 3 huge essay questions all in one, Dr. Faber. Man, can you repeat the last?
Dr. Driver.
Oh,
Sorry, this
Dr.
one's in the
Driver.
chat.
Oh,
Dr. Driver.
Dr.
Yeah.
Driver. Oh,
Yeah.
hey. Oh dear, answering it for the Hebrew Bible professors too.
That's right.
Can you repeat the last component, Dr. Sinis, of that question?
Sure. So essentially, he summed it up just now live in the chat. Just one question. What do you mean by the language of exile? So,
For this project, Dr. Driver, I was really focusing, I started by really focusing on just that physical, geographical dislocation. So not a dislocation by choice, but a forced displacement out of your familiar territory as a community of faith. So those were the aspects I focused on initially, framing the flood and the pandemic as an exile experience in that regard. As the research unfolded, though, and as these 5 lessons began to take shape, there were these other sort of 5 components of exile that went beyond just the geographical and physical nature. The disruption, life as we know it is disrupted. The disconnection, part of the diaspora is the disconnection. The disorientation, our frames of reference are gone. And certainly, so much of the theology we have now of the Hebrew Bible, even the way the narratives were framed and edited, come out of that exilic time period, that reorientation, theologically speaking. And then the distraction and the despair as well. Those are all, I think, themes found in the biblical account of exile, the theological exile we find in the exilic texts and post-exilic texts. So, the limits, I think, are the limits of any metaphor. And I wish I had my theological essay handy, because Walter Brueggemann has a great quote that, we use the word exile, and it is a slippery, nebulous, flexible term. It's a playful term for Walter Brueggemann. It is not a point-to-point comparison, but it is a juxtaposition that enlivens how we view our experiences today. I hope that does a little bit of justice to your question. It's a good one.
thank you. Okay, we're going to go with one more question. This is from Dr. Alida Faber, a faculty member at AST. Could you comment on the following quote, given what the ministers say about knowing the territory, this idea of we've seen this before? And the quote is, not knowing what to say and knowing one does not know, perhaps for a very long time, and dramatizing the fact that one is confronted with something for which one knows that one does not yet have the words. This is a very important ethical capacity. It's a quote by Roman Coles.
That is quite a quote. I'm just reading it again. Thank you, Dr. Faber, for sharing that. I'm getting from your question, Dr. Faber, so, there's an important ethical capacity, according to Roman Coles, that it is important to admit we don't know, to not knowing what to say and knowing one does not know. I wouldn't, as much as the attention-grabbing headline of "we know this territory" certainly applied in many ways, I would not suggest that Reverend Jordan, Reverend Alex went in thinking they knew it all. In fact, I think they went into the COVID pandemic, if I may speak on their behalf based on the research, knowing things that maybe others, how am I trying to phrase this? I think they went in aware that there would be blind spots, and not even getting caught up in that euphoric roller coaster up of the "we can do it" mountain. No, This is going to be a valley. We don't know how long it's going to last. We know it's going to last a long time. There's so much we don't know. And we've been in that place of not knowing before. I think that was a huge part of the shift from one to the other. We've been in this place, in this valley of not knowing. We know what that's like, not perhaps knowing all the particulars of the crisis. So there was that humility and recognition of the unknown.
Well, thank you, Matthew. There's a lot more that could be said on this topic, and we are, you know, all sources indicate that this will be with us for a while. The pandemic will be with us for a while. So thank you for providing lessons from your research and from the congregation that might not know all the details, but certainly knows this kind of territory. Thank you all for being part of this presentation. And please, a reminder to fill out that feedback form. It is valuable, and it is important to us to know what you think about this and about all the presentations. Please join us in 1 hour for the next presentation, which is from Cynthia O'Connell, and it's called Believing in Possible Things: Theology, Choice, and Sexual Identity. Thank you all again for being here, and Matthew, thank you for your wisdom.